He never expected company, let alone 5 pairs of eyes watching him with silent hope. Grady was a widowed lumberjack with no children of his own. Until one stormy dusk, 5 were dropped on his porch like forgotten tools. The mule-drawn cart didn't even stop properly. Its wheels groaned, spattered wet mud, and then it jolted on again down the mountain trail as though the man driving it couldn't stomach lingering near the door he'd just used like a dumping ground. Grady Foster stood just inside, axe still in one hand, the other slowly reaching to undo the latch. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He never did. The path to his cabin was treacherous even in summer, and now, with snow chasing the wind, only the truly desperate came up this high, which was exactly what he saw when the door creaked open. The children didn't speak. They were silent as scarecrows, but smaller, wet and shivering. 5 of them, stair-stepped in age, none older than 10 by Grady's guess. The oldest boy, dark-haired and wary, stood slightly ahead of the rest like he thought he should shield them, though he could barely stand upright himself. Their clothes were mismatched, too thin, soaked through. A few had shoes. One was barefoot. None carried anything. Grady didn't ask questions. Not at first. He just opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside. The children didn't hesitate. Not out of trust, but out of bone-deep necessity. They filed in, dragging wet footprints, onto his wooden floor. The girl in the middle, maybe 6, kept holding her baby brother against her chest, and Grady caught a glimpse of her lips moving silently in some kind of counting rhythm. The boy at the back flinched when the wind slammed. The door shut behind him. Still, they said nothing. Grady laid his axe down slowly, like it might scare them if he moved too fast. Then he walked past them toward the hearth, tossing in another 2 logs and stoking the fire high. His eyes never left the 5 small strangers gathered in his home. He didn't ask their names, or who'd left them, or why. There was time for that later, if they survived the night. He warmed stew from earlier, rationing it without looking like he was rationing. He ladled 5 bowls. Not 6. He ate nothing. The children did, in silence, except the littlest one who cried once when the steam touched his cold nose. The oldest boy quickly dipped his fingers in the bowl to cool it, then spooned it gently into the baby's mouth like he'd done it 1,000 times. Grady watched. Then, finally, he asked, "Your father?" The boy didn't look up. Said, "We weren't worth the food." Grady nodded once. Said nothing more. They fell asleep in a pile like puppies, all on the same quilt in front of the fire. Grady didn't go to bed. He just sat in the wooden chair nearby, boots still on, staring into the flames with his arms crossed, thoughts too thick to untangle. He hadn't held a child in nearly a decade. Not since the sickness took Martha and their stillborn son with her. It had hollowed him out. He'd thought himself done with family after that. Cut from that cloth once, maybe, but stitched no longer. But the silence in the cabin tonight felt different than the one he was used to. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them now. Their breathing, their twitches and turns in their sleep. Every so often, one would whimper and another would hush them in half-sleep. By dawn, Grady had made a decision he didn't know how to name. It wasn't loud, not even inside him, but it had a shape, a gravity. He started chopping wood early, stacked it high. He made breakfast for 6. They didn't run. That afternoon, the girl with the baby looked up at him as he passed her a biscuit and said, "Is this your house?" He nodded. "Is it ours now, too?" He paused, then nodded again. She turned back to the baby like the answer was good enough. Over the next 2 days, he learned their names, sort of. The oldest boy was Eli. The next was Tommy, then Ruthie, then Caleb, and the baby had no name but Muffin, which Ruthie insisted was not negotiable. Grady didn't argue. They didn't speak much about where they came from. Just the edge of a town half a day's ride away, a shack near a saloon. Their mother had died 2 winters ago, and their father had stopped calling them anything but mouths. Apparently, Grady's name had been scribbled onto a scrap of paper by a woman who served drinks at the saloon and had once seen Martha's picture in a pendant Grady wore when he came down for supplies. The woman had told the father where to go. He had delivered them without a word and kept going. No one knew where. It wasn't until the fourth day that anything shifted. Grady had gone to town for extra flour and a pair of boots for Tommy's blistered feet. When he returned, it was raining. Eli stood on the porch, soaked through again but standing tall. Not like a boy trying to protect something, like one trying to grow fast enough to become the kind of man who could. Grady handed him the parcel with the boots. Eli blinked. "You bought these?" Grady nodded. "You gonna want 'em back if we leave." "I don't want you to leave." Eli didn't answer, just went back inside, quiet as always. Later that night, when the fire was low and most of the children were asleep, Muffin started fussing again. Grady took him gently, rocked him back and forth like Martha used to, humming low. That's when Ruthie, already half asleep on the rug nearby, whispered, "Papa's better now." Grady blinked. He kept rocking. She smiled faintly, already drifting. "Not the old one. You." He didn't cry. Not exactly, but something moved in his chest like thawing ice. The next morning, Grady rose before the sun, as usual, but there was a lightness in his step he hadn't known since Martha. He chopped twice as much wood as he needed, not because the fire was running low, but because Tommy had tried swinging the axe the day before, and Grady had quietly resolved to make the boy stronger than his wounds, stronger than the man who made them. The days passed with quiet rhythm. Ruthie took to collecting berries in a little basket she'd woven out of dried grass. Muffin, now regularly fed and bathed, had started giggling, his legs kicking the air like he'd discovered joy itself. Caleb followed Grady like a shadow, asking few questions but watching everything. Eli was still stiff, still cautious, but his shoulders had settled, less hunched, less ready for another blow. Grady worked double time in the woods, always close, enough to hear the children's laughter but far enough to clear his head. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Food didn't multiply. Clothes wore thin, and they were 5 new mouths in a life that hadn't expected any. Still, not once did he regret the door he'd opened, but peace in the mountains never lasted long. On the 7th day, the wind brought a sound with it. Wagon wheels, distant, at first, then louder, too heavy to be a traveler, too fast to be the postman. Grady stood by the chopping stump, axe tight in his hand, every inch of his body tensing. Eli burst from the house, panting. "There's a man coming." Grady's stomach turned cold. He didn't have to ask who. The wagon came into view, rough-built, barely held together. On the bench sat the father, hair matted, eyes bloodshot. In one hand, a flask. In the other, the reins. He looked smaller in the daylight than Grady had imagined. Smaller and meaner. He pulled up with a wheeze of horses, spit over the edge, and stared at Grady like he was a termite infestation. "I've come for my kids," he said, voice slurring only slightly. Grady didn't move. "You left them." "I can leave my own kin, can also take 'em back. They're not cargo. They're mine," the man snapped. "Don't make me say it again, old man." Grady glanced toward the cabin. Eli was standing behind the doorframe, jaw tight, fingers white-knuckled. Ruthie held Muffin. Tommy and Caleb weren't visible, probably hiding. Grady took one step forward. "You don't want them." "You want what comes with them," the man scoffed. "Ain't none of your business what I want. You got something that belongs to me." Grady's voice turned quiet. "Not anymore." The father's eyes narrowed. "You think this is done? I got law on my side. Blood's blood. No court in the territory will hand children to a man who leaves them like sacks on a porch, especially not with a bottle in his hand. You think anyone up here's going to listen to some hermit lumberjack over a father?" Grady stepped closer, eyes level. "I think if you take one step closer to this house, you won't walk away." The Man studied him, spat again, then gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You got fire. Bet you had a wife once. She die before or after you found out you can't make none of your own? Grady's grip on the axe tightened, but he didn't lift it. The man laughed, short and sharp. Didn't take much to figure. Whole town says you're useless for bloodlines. And now here you are, pretending these 5 ain't a charity case. Get off my land. He didn't. He sat still, then slowly reached into the wagon and pulled out a sheet of paper. Folded. Crumpled. He tossed it toward Grady's feet. Got signatures, he said. Old friend of mine at the sheriff's office gave me legal claim. Ain't pretty, but it's there. Grady didn't pick it up. The man sneered. You think you can keep 'em? You'll run out of food, out of patience. Kids cry. Kids bleed. Kids break things, and none of 'em are yours. I know that, Grady said evenly, and I still wouldn't hand them to you if you had every lawman in the county behind you. The man's face darkened. You'll regret this. He turned the reins, spitting curses into the wind as the wagon wheeled around. It rolled back, into the trees, snapping twigs and lurching into the woods with a trail of dust behind it. Grady didn't breathe until the sound vanished completely. Back in the cabin, Eli still hadn't moved from the door. He's not coming back, right? Grady looked at him, then the others. He will, but next time, we'll be ready. That night, Grady didn't sleep. He kept the axe by the hearth, oiling it slowly. The children didn't ask why he kept getting up to look out the window. But Ruthie brought him a cup of warm milk and tucked Muffin beside him with a whispered, "He sleeps best next to you." The days that followed were sharper. Grady fortified the cabin, cut more wood, doubled the stores. He taught Eli how to use a hammer properly, showed Tommy how to tie knots, built Ruthie a better basket. Even Caleb, quiet and reclusive, began. Sketching in the dirt outside, always drawing the same figure, Grady with all 5 children under his arms like bear cubs. Then, one clear afternoon, the law arrived. A man with a badge. Not someone Grady recognized, and not from their local township. He was stiff-spined, gray-bearded, and carried a letter from a judge half a territory away. "I've come for the children," he said. "You have no formal custody. The father claims abandonment is false." Grady stepped out onto the porch, hands at his sides. "You didn't see the way they arrived." "I don't need to. The law says. The law isn't here in the snow. These kids aren't fed by paper and ink." The sheriff frowned. "Don't make this difficult. If you resist, there'll be charges." Inside, Ruthie began crying. Caleb clung to her skirt. Eli stood up straight. "Sir," the boy said, loud enough to be heard through the door, "we're not going back." The sheriff hesitated. "I don't care what paper you got," Eli continued. "He's not our papa. He never was." The old man's eyes moved back to Grady. "Is that true?" Grady didn't answer. He opened the door wider. "Ask them." So he did. Each child, one by one, said the same thing, that the man who left them behind never loved them, never held them, never fed them unless it was scraps, that their mother had whispered to them before she passed, "One day someone better will come," and they believed Grady was that man. The sheriff stood there, silent, for a long time. Then he folded the letter, tucked it away, and said, "No one will be coming back up here any time soon. You'd best be careful all the same." Then he left, and, as the children cheered quietly, wrapping their arms around each other, Eli walked up to Grady. "Sir," he said, almost too soft to hear, "do you want us?" Grady crouched down, eyes level. "I didn't know I did, but now I can't imagine this house without you." Eli nodded, then whispered, "Papa." Grady's throat closed. He tried to speak, but nothing came out, so he just pulled Eli into his arms. And for the first time in a decade, Grady Foster wept. Grady rose before dawn again, not because of habit this time, but because Muffin's wail had shattered the pre-dawn silence. He padded across the floor of the cabin with bare feet, cradled the smallest boy to his chest, and walked gently back and forth while the wind rattled against the shutters. But this morning, the cry was not hunger or cold. Muffin had a fever. Ruthie noticed first. She touched his forehead with the back of her small hand and stepped back with wide, solemn eyes. "He's burning." Grady felt it too. The heat pulsing off the child wasn't right. He rocked him longer, murmured softly, dipped a rag into cool water and pressed it against his skin. But by noon, Muffin's cries had turned to whimpers, his little limbs gone limp. "Ruthie," Grady said, "I need you to hold him while I ride." He hadn't saddled the mare in weeks. He'd gone into town only once since the children arrived. Supplies were getting thin, and the fever spreading faster than he'd seen in years. He didn't know medicine. Martha had known herbs, remedies, prayers, but she was gone. And this little boy, too young even to speak, was breathing harder than any man should. "Don't let the fire go out. Don't open the door for anyone," he told Eli and Caleb as he wrapped Muffin in an extra blanket. "And if I'm not back by night, lock the cabin. Stay quiet. I'll return as soon as I can." Tommy clung to his leg, but Grady gently peeled the boy off and climbed onto the mare. It took 2 hours to reach the edge of town. The wind was slicing through trees like knives. Clouds above looked ready to burst. The sun had vanished, leaving only gray light across the land. He rode into town fast, his shirt damp with snowflakes that melted too quick, the fevered bundle pressed to his chest. The apothecary was run by an old man named Dr. Trigg, half medic, half priest, and all grumble, but he knew every root and powder within 100 miles. Grady burst through the door, out of breath. "Fever, infant, won't cry anymore." Trigg looked up, startled, but then saw the baby in his arms and nodded once. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't need to. "Lay him on the table. Quick!" Grady obeyed. The old man set to work, measuring tinctures, pressing the back of his hand to the child's neck, counting breaths aloud. "How long?" "Since morning." "Was he cold before the fever?" "Yes." "You got other young ones at home?" Grady nodded. "They'll be next." Grady's blood ran cold. "What do I do?" Trigg poured a mixture into a small bottle and thrust it toward him. "Half of this in his mouth now. The other half by dawn. Then rub this salve on his chest every 2 hours. If he keeps breathing like this after sundown, come back. If he worsens, ride for the Reverend and pray." Grady gave what coins he had. Not enough, but Trigg didn't count them. "Keep him close to skin," the doctor added, "and don't let the others share a blanket." Grady wrapped Muffin up again and rode hard through the gathering snow, but the wind was no longer kind. By the time he reached the tree line near his land, the sun had vanished completely. The snow had thickened. Branches sagged under the weight of it. The mare slowed, unsure of her steps. And then, hoof prints, fresh ones, not his. He dismounted and crouched, one hand brushing the powdery surface. Too large to be a deer. Wagon wheels, too, light and sharp. They were headed straight for his cabin. Grady didn't wait. He mounted again and rode faster, heart thudding, with every breath. As he crested the rise near his property, he saw it, the flicker of a lantern swaying near his front door, a man's silhouette, and then a second. He nearly fell off the mare in his hurry. As he approached, one of the men turned. His voice cut through the dark. "There he is." 2 of them. Not the father, but strangers, armed. The kind that didn't knock. Grady didn't ask questions. He handed Muffin, still swaddled, to Ruthie, who appeared from the shadows. "Inside. Lock the door. Don't open it." He turned back to the men, hand already on his axe. "Who sent you?" One of them shrugged. "A man who says you stole his blood. Says you've got 5 mouths up here that ain't yours." Grady narrowed his eyes. "And you aim to bring them back?" "We aim to be paid. You can make it easy or hard." Behind him, the door shut. Grady breathed through his nose, the old ache in his shoulder from logging rising again. But he stood, taller. You got one chance to walk away. The taller one laughed. You think we're scared of a lonely old hermit? No, Grady said quietly, but you should be. And he stepped forward. The fight was brief, but brutal. Grady wasn't. Young. He wasn't fast, but he was strong. Decades of chopping pine had made his shoulders thick, his arms like tree trunks. And he wasn't fighting for his life. He was fighting for theirs. The first man lunged and caught the handle of the axe, but Grady twisted it sideways and used the momentum to slam his shoulder into the man's chest. The second pulled a knife, slashing upward, but Grady ducked and let the blade graze his arm. Pain flared, but he didn't stop. He swung the blunt side of the axe into the man's ribs. There was a crunch, a cry, and then silence. Both men were on the ground, breathing, but not willing to get up again. He didn't wait to see if they would. He dragged them, both, one after the other, to the trees, tied their hands with rope, and left them to the mercy of the coming snow. By the time he returned to the cabin, his shirt was torn and blood was soaking his sleeve. Eli opened the door without a word. Ruthie was crying, clutching Muffin against her chest. The baby's face was red, but his breathing had steadied. Grady collapsed in the doorway, barely catching himself. Eli caught his arm. "You're hurt?" "Not bad." But it was. The cut on his arm needed stitching. The bone might have cracked where the knife struck. He ignored it. He took Muffin back into his arms and sat by the fire. Hours passed. Snow pounded the roof. Tommy fell asleep beside his knee. Caleb leaned against his shoulder. In the darkest hour of night, Ruthie whispered, he stopped shaking. Grady held the baby closer. The worst had passed. For now. But when dawn came and the snow cleared, Grady stepped outside and found the spot where he'd left the men. They were gone. The ropes were there. Cut. Blood in the snow. Tracks headed back. To the road. And a single line scrawled in the bark of a tree, carved deep with a blade. "We're not done." Grady stood still, the wind howling around him. He knew what was coming, and he knew he'd never let them take these children. Not while he had breath. Grady didn't speak of the words carved into the bark. Not to Ruthie, not to Eli, not even to himself aloud. But from that morning on, he began to listen differently. The rustle of a branch, the call of a raven overhead, even the way the snow melted on the roof. It all told him something now. He was being watched. Not by the Lord above, but by men. The kind of men who thought a child could be priced like cattle, handed off with a bottle of whiskey and a slurred threat. He didn't touch his axe the next morning. He strapped it to his belt instead. Each of the children carried a smaller task now. Caleb gathered wood. Eli watched the back door. Tommy followed Grady like a pup, silent except for the occasional hiccup from crying. Ruthie, sharp-eyed and solemn, kept Muffin warm, crushed dried herbs Trig had given, and pressed them into his water with steady hands too old for her years. The cabin was quiet most of that day. Too quiet. Grady felt it crawling up his back around dusk, the kind of quiet that warns a hunter before the trap snaps. He stepped out just before sundown to split more logs, and froze halfway through the swing, a single ribbon of red tied to the tree stump. He hadn't put it there. The children hadn't either. He dropped the axe. Grady picked it up slowly and stared at it. It was silk, bright red, knotted carefully like a gift. And beneath the stump, tucked into the moss, was a paper. Folded twice, it read, "You can keep the brats. We want what's under the floor." Grady's throat dried instantly. He read it again, then crumpled the paper and stuffed it into his coat. Under the floor? His boots thundered back inside. The children looked up. Ruthie blinked. "What is it?" Grady moved the table aside. With a groan and a shove, he pried up the center floorboard. Dust and mice fled. There was nothing beneath the first plank but earth and stone. He kept going. The third plank revealed something unexpected. A hollow space, wrapped in linen, tied with twine. He pulled it out carefully. Heavy. Solid. He undid the twine with trembling fingers, and there, in the pale firelight, lay 3 bricks of silver, dull, rough, but unmistakably precious. Next to them, a revolver wrapped in oilcloth, and a folded note, weathered and curled with age. He opened it slowly. "If you found this, I didn't make it back. Sell the silver only if you must, but you'll know what to do when the time comes." M. Grady stared at it. M. Martha. It was. Her handwriting. All these years he'd never known. She'd never told him. Not once in their 12 years together had she mentioned hiding silver under the house. And yet here it was. A fortune in wait, and the cold glint of an old revolver, loaded and ready. The children crowded near. Ruthie whispered, "What is it?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. But he worried. By morning, the tracks around the cabin had doubled. Men had come in the night again, not to break in, not to shout or threaten, to remind him, to see how close they could get. Grady buried the silver near the well behind the cabin that afternoon. He moved like he was planting corn. No one could see him but the trees. He taught the children that evening how to use a slingshot. Eli caught on fast. Caleb got frustrated. Ruthie said she didn't need to learn, but she watched anyway. The revolver stayed on the table beside his plate all through dinner. The next day, Grady didn't go to town. He couldn't risk it. But the supplies were low. No milk left, no sugar, not even salt, only cornmeal and beans. He mixed it into porridge and fed the children in silence. Then, just as they were finishing, they heard it, a scream, faint, from the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was human. High-pitched, terrified. Grady stood, grabbed the revolver and motioned for the children to stay down, but Ruthie clutched his sleeve. "What if it's one of them?" Grady paused. "What if they're trying to trick you?" He hesitated. The scream echoed again, closer now, and something in his chest burned, because what if it wasn't a trick? He stepped outside, cautious, revolver drawn, and then he saw her. A girl, no more than 7, running barefoot across the snow, hair tangled, cheeks red, dress torn. Behind her, 2 men, one with a rope, the other with a whip. Grady didn't hesitate this time. He ran. The girl tripped and fell face first into the snow just as one man reached her. But before his hand could close around her wrist, a shot rang out. The bullet missed the man's head by inches. Both pursuers turned. Grady didn't aim again. He sprinted toward the girl, caught her under the arms and lifted her to his chest. She clung to his coat, sobbing. The men didn't chase him. Not yet. But as Grady ran back toward the cabin, he heard the whistle behind him. A long, shrill signal. They weren't alone. He made it inside, bolted the door. Ruthie locked the back. Eli drew the shutters. Grady laid the girl down beside the fire and covered her with a blanket. She was shaking. Ruthie asked gently, "What's your name?" The girl barely whispered, "Cassie." "Where's your home?" Grady asked. "Gone." "Parents?" She shook her head, and then she said something that turned the fire inside him cold. "They were taking us all. Not just me. There were other wagons." Grady stared. "How many others?" Cassie didn't answer. She just curled tighter into the blanket and cried. He couldn't sleep that night. Neither could Ruthie. She sat up beside Cassie, stroking her hair while the storm pressed harder against the walls. Grady stepped outside just before dawn. There were no fresh tracks, no bodies, no campfires. But near the base of the trees, something was waiting. Pressed into the snow, a doll, ragged, one eye missing, dressed in blue. It had been left facing the house. Grady picked it up and turned it over. There, stitched into the dress, was a name. Lydia. He stared at it, cold sweat down his back. There was only one reason someone would leave a doll like that. It was bait. He walked inside, slow, jaw clenched. He'd fought storms. He'd buried a wife. He'd learned to live with silence. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something else rise in him. Not just fear, not just anger. A calling. He looked at Ruthie, who had started braiding Cassie's hair gently. He looked at Eli, who was trying to sharpen a stick into something like a spear. He looked at Muffin, sleeping soundly again for the first time in days. And then he whispered to himself, barely loud enough to hear, "They're mine now. Whatever was coming for them, whatever storm of men and money and evil was headed toward this mountain, would have to face Grady Carter first, and Grady wasn't going to run." By the time noon rolled around, Grady had built 2 traps and was halfway through laying a third. Not the kind meant for catching deer or rabbit. These were for men. A taut wire across the path, a bed of stakes concealed by pine needles, a snare hung 10 feet off the ground where a man's boot might yank it tight. He hadn't made such things in years. Not since the war. Not since he'd first come home to Martha and swore he'd never live by violence again. But the doll, Lydia, had changed something. So had Cassie, and so had Ruthie's quiet voice the night before, after all the children had fallen asleep. "They'll come back, won't they?" Had nodded. Ruthie hadn't cried. She just moved closer to the fire, pulling her knees up, her chin pressed between them like she'd done that before. "I thought so," she'd said. "I heard one of 'em say something about finishing what they started. That's what they told Daddy once." It took Grady nearly 2 seconds to ask, "Do you mean your father was part of this?" She didn't blink. "He owed them. He lost us in a bet. That's what Mama said." And she hadn't spoken again after that. Now, that morning, with the sun sharp and harsh overhead, Grady worked faster. The traps were only part of the plan. The real defense was time. Keep them away long enough and maybe they'd lose interest. Maybe they'd head back to town. Maybe they'd forget. But Grady had lived long enough to know evil didn't forget. By mid-afternoon, he spotted the glint of something high on the ridge. A mirror. A signal. He ducked back under cover. They were watching. Just passing by. Watching. He returned to the cabin and locked every door. Ruthie was boiling roots for stew. Eli had fashioned a kind of spear out of a broken chair leg. Caleb stood guard at the window with a rock in hand. Cassie didn't speak much, but she had drawn a picture in the dirt outside before breakfast. A line of wagons. A tall man with a whip. A little girl in a red dress with her hands outstretched. The girl in the red dress had no mouth. Grady didn't ask. By evening, the cabin felt more like a fortress. The revolver stayed on the mantel, loaded. A hunting knife tucked in Grady's boot. The children were fed in silence. Even Muffin didn't fuss much anymore. It was like he knew. Grady waited until the fire was low, then crept outside. The traps were untouched. No tracks, no noise. But the air felt wrong. Too still. He turned to go back in, and stepped right into a rope snare. His ankle jerked up violently and he slammed into the ground with a groan. The breath was knocked out of him. Before he could reach for his knife, boots thundered in the snow. 3 men, 1 tall, 1 hunched, 1 limping. They moved quick. Not amateurs. Not drunk. Organized. Grady lashed out, caught the tall one in the knee, but the limper swung a club and caught him across the temple. His world spun. The trees swam. Everything went black. When he woke, the fire was out. His head throbbed. He was inside the cabin, but not alone. The tall one was there. So was the limper. The children were pressed into the corner, eyes wide, silent. Caleb had a bruise on his cheek. Ruthie's lip was bleeding. Eli's face was pale with fury. Cassie wasn't there. Neither was the baby. Grady tried to sit up. The limper shoved him down with a boot. "Easy now, woodsman," the tall one said, grinning. "We didn't hurt him bad, just enough to make you listen." Grady's voice came rough. "Where are the others? The little girl and the baby? Oh, they're with Jarek now. He's gentler than us, likes to walk 'em round the woods, show 'em the stars." Grady surged up. The limper kicked him hard in the ribs. "Easy," the tall man said again. "Now, you're going to tell us where the silver is. The silver you dug up and buried again like a fool." Grady's head swam. "You don't talk. Boy dies next." The limper growled, pointing at Eli. Ruthie stepped forward. "Please, don't." The tall one ignored her. "I'll count to 3, he said. "Then we get noisy." Grady didn't move. 1. He met Ruthie's eyes. She nodded, just barely. 2. He whispered, "Well?" The tall one leaned in. "What?" "The well," Grady croaked. "Behind the cabin. It's buried 6 feet down, west of the rope swing." The tall man grinned. "See? Wasn't so hard." He motioned to the limper, who left with a shove of the door. Grady leaned against the wall. Blood in his mouth. Vision doubling. But then something unexpected. A thud, a grunt, a scream, and silence. The tall man turned, confused, and a second later the door burst open. Cassie stood there holding Eli's slingshot. Behind her, the limper lay unconscious, in the snow, a rock beside his head. "I got him," she whispered. The tall man lunged for her. Grady moved faster. He grabbed the poker from the fire and slammed it into the man's jaw. The revolver. Where was it? Ruthie tossed it to him. Grady caught it midair and leveled it at the tall man. Hands. The man froze. Cassie darted back inside. The children circled Grady now like a wall. The man laughed, blood on his teeth. "You ain't gonna shoot. You ain't that kind." Grady's hand didn't shake. "Try me. You shoot me, more will come. I know. You think you can keep 'em safe forever." Grady's voice was steel. "No, but I can keep them safe tonight." The man moved, the revolver cracked once, and the tall man slumped backward, arm shattered, blood soaking the snow. Grady didn't look away. The man whimpered. "I didn't kill you," Grady said, "but I will if I see your face again." He turned. To Ruthie. "Rope." She brought it fast. They tied the tall man's legs, wrists, and dragged him to the tree stump where Lydia's doll had been. Grady tied him to the trunk, stuffed his mouth with cloth, and pinned a note to his chest. "These children are not for sale." Then he turned back to the cabin. The fire was still low. The stew had gone cold, but Muffin slept in Ruthie's arms. Now, safe. Cassie was curled up beside Eli. Caleb, bruised but whole, was stirring the fire again. Grady leaned on the table and let the silence settle. They weren't safe yet. Not truly, but they were together, and they were no longer waiting to be saved. They were fighting. Grady didn't sleep that night, not even with the children breathing quiet around him, not with the revolver still warm from where he'd fired it, not with the scent of iron and pine on his clothes. He sat in the rocking chair Martha had once carved the arms on, and listened to every creak in the timbers, every gust of wind, every strange bird cry. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Come, dawn. The tall man was gone. Not dead, just missing. The rope had been cut, not slipped. The cloth he'd been gagged with lay soaked in the snow. The blood trail led only a few feet before it vanished entirely, and that was worse than if it had gone for miles. Someone had helped him. Ruthie was the first to notice. She came outside with the tin bowl of oats and froze, bowl tipping from her. "Hands! He's not there!" Grady stepped past her, jaw set. Eli stood in the doorway, a fist full of rocks. "Did he run?" Grady didn't answer. They spent the morning reinforcing the cabin, more logs stacked under the windows, heavy furniture against the door, knives hidden in nooks where small hands could grab fast. Grady taught Eli how to use a bow he carved from ashwood. Caleb learned how to scatter dried beans outside the doors. He explained it would snap under boots and give them warning. Cassie took to watching the tree line. Ruthie kept Muffin on her back in a sling she made from old flour sack cloth. There was no crying, no whining. The air had gone tight and brittle, like something about to snap. By midday, Grady went to the ridge to scan. He saw smoke in the far distance. A fire. It could have been a campfire, but he doubted it. Too thick, too tall. It was a signal, or worse, a warning. That night he didn't build a fire. They all ate cold food, huddled in their coats. The children spoke in whispers. Caleb started humming under his breath. Ruthie hushed him gently. Just before midnight, Ruthie stood at Grady's side by the front door. "Grady," she said, "when this is all over, will we have to leave?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then, "Do you want to?" "No." He turned to her. Then no. She nodded. He almost reached out and brushed her hair aside. It had gotten longer, tangled now from days without brushing. She looked older than her years. Then a sound came from the woods. A horse. Not galloping. Slow. Deliberate. Then another. Then the creak of a wagon. Grady motioned the children to silence. Ruthie slipped behind the door, gripping the knife she'd claimed. Eli raised his bow. Cassie held her slingshot. Caleb had a board with nails hammered through it. Outside, torchlight flickered through the trees. Not one or two men, at least 5. Maybe more. One voice rang out, thick with menace. "We know you're in there, old man. We're not going to ask nice again." Grady stepped out onto the porch. The men didn't flinch. One rode a black horse, wide as a barn. Another was missing a hand. He had a hook instead. The third had scars over half his face, and the others didn't even try to hide their pistols. The tall man wasn't among them. Grady said nothing. "We came for what's ours," the hook-handed man barked. Grady's voice was low. "And what's that? The kids. They're not yours. They were bought, fair and square. You buy cattle, not children." Scarface dismounted, pulled out a lasso. "You gonna make this hard?" Grady raised the revolver. The hammer clicked. "I can make it final." Laughter. "You're outnumbered." Grady didn't blink. "I've been outnumbered before." The wind shifted. Snow began to fall. Hookhand said something under his breath, turned to the man beside him, and then chaos. From the trees behind them came a shout. A figure burst from the dark, swinging a shovel like an axe. It was old Mert, the trapper, from across the ridge. Grady hadn't seen him in a year. Behind him came Jasper, the mail runner, and behind Jasper was Mr. Fields, the old preacher with a double barrel. The men whirled to face them, confused. Grady shouted, "Now!" Eli let loose an arrow. It missed, but startled a horse. Cassie flung a rock that hit the man with the hook in the temple. Ruthie stepped outside, fearless, holding Muffin close with one hand, a torch in the other. The gang scattered, caught between fire and fury. Jasper tackled one, knocked him clean off his horse. Old Mert yelled, "That one sold. His boots for whiskey 2 weeks ago. Cowards, the lot of 'em." Grady fired into the air. "Go!" he roared. They went, scattered like dogs. The last one ran straight into Caleb's bean trap. He slipped, hit the ground hard, and by the time he was up again, Preacher Fields was on him with a Bible in one hand and a shotgun in the other. When it was over, they tied up 3 of them. 2 had escaped. The tall one wasn't among them still, but the gang was broken. Old Mert slapped Grady on the back. "Heard whispers in town. Thought I'd see for myself." Preacher Fields nodded solemnly. "Saw that man with the hook trying to trade a coat for a child's shoe. Figured the devil was working overtime." Grady said nothing. Inside, the cabin was still standing. The fire was lit again. The children were warm. That night, the men stayed, to keep watch. Ruthie finally let herself fall asleep sitting up, Muffin on her chest. Cassie and Eli curled up on either side of Grady. It should have been over, but it wasn't, because the next morning, there was a note tacked to the tree where Lydia's doll had once hung, burned into the bark itself with a hot iron. "I'm coming back for them. You can't stop me." No name. But Grady knew who wrote it. The tall man. The one who hadn't spoken since that first night. And when Grady walked to the ridge that afternoon, he saw something new. A cross, freshly planted, with 5 little dolls nailed to it. Each one had a letter, carved into its chest. R, E, C, C, M, Ruthie, Eli, Cassie, Caleb, Muffin. Grady tore it down, but the message was already sent. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. Revenge. Something worse. Back at the cabin, the children waited. "Is he coming?" Ruthie asked. Grady stared at the fire. At the revolver. At the knife in his boot. "Yes," he said, "but we'll be ready." The snow melted faster than it should have for that time of year, like even the mountain wanted the final reckoning, to come and go. The logs dripped day and night, fat drops off the eaves like the ticking of a slow clock. The ground turned to slush, the paths to mud. The woods went quiet. Grady stood outside at dawn every morning, arms crossed, eyes on the ridge. He chopped no wood, he hunted no game. The stockpile was enough, and the children were too afraid to let him out of sight for long. Even Muffin, who had once screamed if held by anyone but Ruthie, now reached his chubby arms to Grady with a sleepy "da" when he passed. He didn't correct him. He didn't know how. No one did. They were waiting for a ghost with steel eyes and no voice. They were waiting for the end of something. Ruthie came up to him one evening as he was oiling the revolver by lamplight. "Grady," she said, "what if he comes when you're asleep?" He looked up, slow. "Then I won't sleep." She nodded, like that made perfect sense, and returned to her blanket in the corner, sitting with Muffin and whispering songs in his ear that no one else remembered but her. That night Grady slept with the revolver on his chest, the knife beneath his pillow. He taught Eli how to reload. He showed Cassie how to tell the sound of a deer from the sound of a man. He taught Ruthie where to hit someone with a rock to make them drop what they're carrying. And still, the man did not come. Days passed. Weeks. They began to think maybe he'd gone. Maybe something else had gotten him. Maybe the devil had called back his own. But then Caleb saw the smoke. It wasn't like before. This one was closer. Too close. Less than half a mile from the cabin. A campfire. "Just one man," Caleb said, eyes wide, breath sharp. Grady walked up the ridge with a scope glass from his old pack. One tent, one fire. No horse, no movement, just waiting. Ruthie came beside him. "It's him." Grady said nothing. That night the children didn't sleep. They sat in their coats around the fire looking at the door like it would burst open. Grady didn't move from his chair. He cleaned the gun again. He checked the door again. He prayed once when he thought they were asleep. The next morning, the tent was gone. In its place, a single boot, upright, pointed at the cabin. Cassie whimpered when she saw it. "He's coming." No one disagreed. That night, a knock came at the door, not loud, not soft. 3 raps. Even. Grady moved like a spring. He gestured for Ruthie to take the others and bolt the trap door in the back. He didn't need to say it. She had them halfway, down before the second knock came. When the room was silent again, Grady opened the door. Just a crack. The tall man stood there, not ragged, not bleeding, not wild, clean, composed, a smile under his dark beard, his eyes colder than any river runoff. He didn't speak. Grady didn't ask him to. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. The man walked in, sat down in the chair. Grady shut the door. Neither moved, no guns, no knives, no fight. Not yet. Then the man finally spoke. Voice like gravel. "You took what was mine." Grady replied, "They were never yours." The man leaned forward. "I paid." Grady didn't blink. "So did I." The man raised his hands. "They were payment for a debt. And what debt does a child owe a father like you?" Silence. The man grinned. "You think they love you? You think calling you Papa makes you anything more than a stand-in?" Grady said nothing. The man went on. "You think you can take 5 kids, give 'em oats and songs, and that makes you better than me?" Grady stepped forward. "I didn't take them. They came. You tricked them. You fed 'em lies." Grady's voice dropped low. "I fed them food." Another silence. Then the man stood. "You've got 1 shot. Let me walk out with one of 'em, my pick, and I leave you alone. The others'll forget in a week. I promise." Grady shook. "His head, I promise," the man whispered again, smile stretching like oil across water. Grady raised the revolver. "No." The man looked down the barrel, unfazed. "You ain't got it in you." He took a step. Grady fired. The shot didn't hit him. Not the man. It hit the doorframe beside his head. The man didn't flinch. He just smiled. "You'll miss next time." Grady cocked the hammer. "Try me." The man held out his arms like a preacher, at the pulpit. "You ain't God, Grady," Grady whispered. "No, but he's watchin'." And this time, he didn't fire. He lowered the revolver. The man blinked, and from behind him, from behind the trap door, came the softest of sounds. A shuffle, a step. Then a voice. "Leave." Ruthie stood in the doorway behind them, Muffin on her, Hip, Eli behind her with the bow, Cassie and Caleb clutching her sleeves. "We ain't yours," Ruthie said. "You're nothing." The man turned. For the first time, he looked confused, like the wind had changed. "You got no claim on us," Eli said. "You sold us, like pigs." The man looked to Grady, then to the children, then to the fire. He didn't speak, just shook his head and left. No fight, no curse. He just walked out the door and into the trees. He never came back. They buried the revolver that night. Grady said no one should hold something that heavy unless they had to. The next week, Preacher Fields came with a wagon full of supplies. A month later, old Mert built a second cabin nearby, just in case. By summer, the children had their own rooms. Ruthie planted flowers where the dolls once hung. Cassie learned to sing. Caleb built a swing. Eli helped Grady chop wood, and Muffin, who never stopped calling Grady Papa, said it loud enough for all the town to hear when they came by for the fall harvest. Grady didn't correct him. He just picked him up, held him close, and said, "That's right." And no one ever asked again who the children belonged to. They were his, all 5, and he was theirs. Forever. The winter that followed was the kind they used to fear. Snow came sudden in early October, heavy as sand and thick enough to trap the front door by morning. Even the wolves moved down the ridge that year, their howls closer to the cabin than ever before. The creak of trees groaning under ice became a regular song in the night, but it didn't shake them. Not anymore. Because that winter, the children weren't just safe. They were home. Grady had to admit sometimes when the wind pressed hard against the windows and the lamp oil burned. Low, He'd look across the firelit room and forget entirely that he used to be alone, used to be childless, used to be only a lumberjack with a cabin, no one visited, and a bed too large for a man who never remarried after burying the only woman he'd loved. But now, Cassie's little boots sat by the stove. Caleb's drawings cluttered the table. Ruthie kept her braid on the left shoulder now to avoid the flour dust when she kneaded bread. Eli had split more logs than any boy his age ought to, and Muffin still hadn't learned to stop pulling off his socks, but he'd learned to climb up Grady's leg to get into his lap, and that counted for more. Some nights, Grady still sat in his old rocking chair, the one that used to creak in an empty house. But now, when it creaked, it was always underweight. A child curled in his lap, a sleepy head against his shoulder, or 2 or 3 sometimes, pressing in like he was the fire itself. No one ever spoke of the man who'd sold them anymore. Ruthie had burned the last doll he made when spring came. Didn't say why, no one asked, and no one cried. There was laughter in the house now, real laughter, and there were other sounds too, soft prayers before meals, the crack of fresh bread loaves splitting, the scrape of pencils on paper as Cassie taught Muffin to draw crooked chickens. But the most surprising sound, to Grady, was singing. It started one morning when Ruthie was hanging a blanket outside. She hummed something. Then Cassie picked it up. Then Muffin tried too. And soon the cabin, once a place of silence, grief, and groaning trees, had a kind of music that no blizzard could hush. It was late in December when Sheriff Ward rode up again, bundled in oilskin and pulling a small sleigh full of packages. He knocked twice, grinning when Grady opened the door. "Land's alive," the sheriff said, stomping snow from his boots. "Looks like a whole town in here now." Grady didn't say much. He never did. But Ruthie ran up and hugged the sheriff's knees. Cassie offered tea. Muffin held up a potato with a bite already taken out of it. Ward blinked down, surprised. "That for me, little fella?" Muffin grinned wide and shoved it into the man's coat pocket. Sheriff Ward chuckled. "Well, that seals it. This one's yours, Grady. No question about it." They sat for an hour, talked of weather, talked of how the schoolhouse was coming along, talked of how Mrs. Filbert down in town had started a fund for orphaned children. Though, Ward added with a wink, "Seems these 5 don't need it." Grady nodded. "They're fine here." Ward looked around. "More than fine, I'd say." He left the sleigh by the door. Inside it, new boots for Ruthie, stitched by Miss Tamsin, who'd once said she couldn't stand children. A carved train. From Mr. Oates, who'd never spoken a kind word in his life but spent 2 weeks in his shed just for Eli. Mittens for all, made from scraps that had been donated by people who didn't even know their names. There were no signatures on the gifts, just love. Grady stood at the window that night, looking out. Snow still falling, but the path to the door was clean now. Always was. Caleb saw to it. Without being asked. "You're waiting again," Ruthie said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Grady turned to her. "Guess I am." "For who this time?" He didn't answer. She came to stand beside him. "You don't have to protect us from ghosts, Grady. I know. They're not coming back." He looked down at her, barely up to his ribs now, but stronger than most grown women he'd known. "I know," he said again. She looked out the window. Then, "What are you waiting for?" Grady thought for a long time. And then, for the first time in months, he spoke the words he hadn't dared to think. "Maybe I'm just waiting for time to stop." Ruthie blinked. "Why?" He looked around, at the fire, at the bunks, at the empty mittens drying by the stove. "Because I don't want this to end." Ruthie smiled. "It won't." He raised an eyebrow. "Not ever," she added, voice firm. She turned and walked back to the others. Grady stayed there, letting the firelight flicker against his coat. And maybe, Just maybe, he believed her. Spring came, soft and sudden. Shoots pushed up through the frost. Chickens were brought in. Cassie built a flower box from leftover kindling and planted daisies. Muffin dumped them out twice. Eli built a scarecrow with Caleb. Ruthie baked the first pie of the year without burning it. That night, Grady sat outside watching the stars. Ruthie joined him. "You know what day it is?" she asked. He didn't answer. She pulled something from her pocket, a pine carving. Rough, not perfect, but clearly shaped like 5 tiny children standing in a row. She handed it to him. "Happy Papa Day," she said, grinning. Grady looked down at it. The wood smelled like the same pine he'd chopped all winter. He ran his thumb over the little carved heads. "You made this?" he asked. "I did." "You learned that in town?" "No," she said. "You taught me." He looked up. She smiled. "You taught me everything I needed." And then, without another word, she went back inside. Grady sat there for a long time, holding that carving, holding everything. And when the wind blew through the pines, it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like home. It sounded like laughter. Sounded like the word he never thought he'd hear in his lifetime. Papa. And this time, he believed it. He really did, because he wasn't just the man who saved them. He was the man they chose. And for the first time in his long, quiet life, he chose them right back.